All right. Well, good afternoon again, and welcome to Drakewell Museum and Park's Encore presentation of our 2020 Drake Day celebration. My name is Melissa Mann, and I'm the museum's site administrator, and I'm your moderator for the afternoon. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with us, the museum is located in Titusville, Pennsylvania, and it is one of the 21 historic sites owned by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and administered by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. Drakewell Museum and Park preserves and interprets the site of the Drake Well, chronicling the birth and development of the petroleum industry in Pennsylvania and its growth into a global enterprise. We are very pleased to have you join us for the encore of our 107th Drake Day. And I would like to thank our event sponsor, the Pennsylvania Independent Oil and Gas Association, as well as our partners, the Friends of Drakewell, Inc., for helping us to bring this program to you. Before we jump into the presentation, I'd like to go over a few logistics and introduce you to the team who is bringing you the presentation today. Attendees, as I already mentioned, your cameras will remain off and your microphones have been muted for the duration of the program. If you would like to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A feature that is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're going to hold most of the questions for the Q&A period following the presentation so that Sue can address answers to the entire crowd. But I'll be monitoring the Q&A throughout the presentation, so if there's a question I can clear up easily and immediately, I'll go ahead and type you a reply. Also, please feel free to use the chat feature to make comments or to converse with your fellow attendees. Amanda Slider, the Associate Director of the Friends of Drakewell, will be monitoring the chat, and she will also be adding resource links for you later in the program. And then another member of our team that you're going to see a bit later is our museum educator, Sarah Goodman. Sarah is at the museum today and will be showcasing some artifacts from collection storage as part of the presentation. Our presenter this afternoon is Susan J. Bates, historian and curator at Drakewell Museum and Park. Sue earned her Master's of Arts in Public History from West Virginia University with an industrial archaeological documentation project of the steam engines used on the air leases south of Kane, Pennsylvania. She has worked for the National Endowment for the Humanities funded West Virginia Newspaper Project at WVU Libraries and at the Erie County Historical Society as the Director of Interpretation, where she developed the Battles Museums of Rural Life. Sue has been floating in oil at Drakewell Museum since 1998. Today, Sue will present a talk entitled Memories to Museum, Honoring Drake and the Birthplace of the Petroleum Industry. Drake Day celebrates the anniversary of the successful Drakewell oil strike. On August 27th, 1859, the Drake Well, located along Oil Creek, just outside Titusville, Pennsylvania, struck oil at 69.5 feet, launching an industry that has forever shaped our modern world. Following Edwin L. Drake's success, oil fever really gripped the region. People rushed up and down the Oil Creek Valley, leasing land, drilling wells, and developing the industry. For nearly a decade, the Oil Creek Valley was the center of the world's oil industry, generating new technologies, business practices, and wealth. However, the pursuit of ever more prosperity led oilmen to begin exploring outside of the Oil Creek Valley and eventually shifted the industry's focus away from Titusville and Oil City in Venango County to first Clarion, Butler, and Armstrong counties, then to the Bradford and McDonald oil fields, and finally to fields outside of Pennsylvania. By the first decade of the 20th century, the center of the petroleum industry had shifted permanently to the burgeoning fields of Texas and Oklahoma. So this period of transition between 1880 and 1950 will be the focus of Sue's presentation. It was during this period that a pocket of individuals in Pennsylvania's oil region began mobilizing to commemorate the significant role that Edwin Drake, the Drake Well, and Pennsylvania played in launching the world's petroleum industry. And with that, I am going to turn the microphone over to Sue so that she can explain what these folks created through their passion and their determination.
Thank you, Melissa. So what did these authors have in common? Alfred Smiley, a few scraps, oily and otherwise. John McLaren, Sketches in Crude Oil. Patrick C. Boyle, The Derrick's Handbook of Petroleum. And Edwin C. Bell, The Life of Colonel Edwin L. Drake. 3 of these men worked in the oil industry. 3 were newspaper men. They all were in Pithole, the famous boomtown. They all published their memories of the early days of the oil industry, and they all honored Drake. 2 of them helped begin the Drake Day Association. They all spoke at the annual gathering celebrating the anniversary of the well. Tonight's presentation will explore how this group of old men turned their memories of the early days of oil into an annual celebration and a museum. So how did these memories of old men grow into a museum? And was it the emotional pleas of the press that led the oil industry men to donate towards the creation of a museum? And why name it for Drake? Drake Day, the annual commemoration of Drake Well's success, has been celebrated for 107 years. In the very early years, this gathering provided people who had experienced the birth of the industry the opportunity to reminisce, share memories, and indulge in some nostalgia. Former Alaska Governor James Shakely, then of Greenville, Mercer County, sent a letter to the first Drake Day gathering in 1913. And this is what his letter said. I take it that the meeting will be a love feast or experience meeting, each giving a history of his struggle with pork and beans, kicking down oil wells, and hauling product to market in barrels. My experience in the oil business goes back to 1859 or 1860. I, with 3 others, drilled a well on the Watson's Flats near the Drake, shortly after the Drake well began to produce. But our well did not produce. My next venture was at Pithole. I was superintendent of the Grant well, which produced 1,000 barrels a day. Oil sold at the well for $6 a barrel. We followed the development to Pleasantville and through Butler and Venango counties, PA, to Texas and Kansas, and still have some interest in Oklahoma. Shakely goes on to say, the Drake Memorial Museum. That name is just what it should be. All honor to Colonel Drake. The existence of petroleum has been known for 2,000 years, but Drake was the first man to discover the process by which oil could be brought to the surface and used for the benefit of mankind. Others have claimed to the original producers of petroleum that Drake's discovery was easy, that anyone could have done it. As the years go by, Drake's achievement will grow greater, and his development of petroleum will be more appreciated by the people of the world. I have a lively recollection of seeing Drake, with his barrel trousers and top boots, crossing Spring Street in Titusville before it was paved. So how was the annual Drake Day event established? And how did the memories of old men become a museum? Most of the accomplishment can be attributed to the work of Edwin C. Bell. Why should we care? What relevance do the memories have for us? And why should we remember them? Edwin Bell came to the Pennsylvania oil region from Maine in 1868. He started drilling and pumping wells at Cottage Hill in Oil City, then Shamburg, then the church run field north of Titusville. A driller and pumper, he moved to this house on the Miller Farm Road in 1871. In 1872, he married Carrie Morrell, a childhood friend from Maine. He began collecting data and documents to preserve the memory of the rapidly growing industry. He made notes of men, wells, and oil towns that came and went in the Oil Creek and Allegheny River valleys. In 1874, he began his writing career, submitting to several newspapers and thinking about starting his own, which he did in 1877. The Titusville Leader lasted less than 3 months. Without a press, he said, the expense and inconvenience blighted its hope for success. But perhaps it was his politics, backing the Greenback Party in support for free coinage of silver in an age of trading oil certificates. The Republic also was short-lived and ended in November 1882 after only 1 month. Bell wrote, "The Republic takes the position today to sweep forward the great battle of those who toil." He urged working men to vote, writing, "And unless the voters arise to the importance of arresting the plunge of monopolies and bad government towards a monarchy, they awaken in but a few years to the fact that to correct these evils without revolution will be beyond their power. To bring the nation back to the simple forms of equality before the law will be the mission of the Republic." Clearly, the National Labor Party wasn't popular in the oil fields either, or perhaps it was Bell's railing against aristocracies and centralized wealth in a community filled with oil wealth. The Bugle he would publish later. So Bell went back to writing columns for other papers like the Oil City Blizzard. In the years following Edwin Drake's death in 1880, Bell began to champion the cause of erecting a suitable memorial for the man who successfully drilled that well. In his August 14, 1885 column, he wrote, "Ye Blizzard scribe is ready to contribute a small portion of the money to erect a monument to the memory of Drake, who drilled the first well. Here in Titusville, we will undertake to receive subscriptions in small or large sums for the purpose of building the memorial." Reminding readers of the sum sent to New York City to support the Statue of Liberty, he said, "Why not raise a small, if not a large sum, to commemorate the deeds of a man whose Yankee genius and perseverance produced the product from the earth that built this, as well as every other city in the oil country? How about the Standard and Tidewater folks? Could they not contribute a portion of the amount? Could not each oil exchange do something for it? Could not Colonel Roberts do something?" Certainly without meaning to, this caused controversy. Patrick Boyle, former oil scout and owner-editor of the Oil City Derrick, made fun of Bell, even labeling him a capitalist and deriding him as a simple typesetter. Bell struck back at Brother Boyle and warned employees of the Derrick to keep an eye on the king of scouts, who was perhaps suffering from a diseased brain. Bell called him Vicious Boyle and challenged everyone to donate as much as Bell was willing to, so a monument at the site of the Drake well could be built, ending his column with, "What say you, Patrick?" Sadly, Carrie Bell passed away in March of 1886 at the age of 46. Her obituary read in part, "Coupled with an extensive education and artistic taste, Mrs. Bell possessed literary abilities of a high order, and all knew her as a refined and cultured lady. I wonder what influence she had on Bell's newspaper career. Bell, in his sorrow, somehow kept writing. David Emery, who had established a fortune in the oil industry, must have heard Bell's call, because he purchased the lease on which contained the Drake well that same year. He drilled on down to the third sand with the steel derrick, hoping to bottle and sell the oil to raise the money needed to build a monument. Unfortunately, Emery died in 1891. The 1892 flood and fire washed away the derrick, leaving only a pipe sticking out of the ground. While continuing to champion a memorial, Bell also contributed to other projects that celebrated the achievement of Drake and the well. In 1895, he helped photographer John Mather publish the Mather's Historical Oil Region Views of Western Pennsylvania. Each book is unique. Bell wrote the introduction, and this volume contains a write-up on the Drake well. It, of course, includes Drake's photographic portrait taken by Mather, as well as a view of the McCrae farm in the Oil Creek Valley. In 1897, Bell started the Bugle, which was hailed by the three other editors in the region, the Oil City Blizzard, Titusville Morning Herald, and the Titusville World. Bell still railed against injustices while trying to stay apolitical. In one editorial, he called the oil magnate, banker, and industrialist, John C. McKinney, a pompous autocrat who sets up his own private ambition as paramount to the general welfare. Bell also used his publication to honor Drake. He published a series of articles, which eventually became his book, The Life of Colonel Edwin L. Drake. At some point in the 1890s, Bell and P.C. Boyle of the derrick mended fences. As the turn of the century came around, Bell worked with Boyle on a number of different oil history publications. However, despite making nice with Boyle, Bell still faced difficulties amongst the oil crowd, and this affected his dream to memorialize Drake and the Drake well. Bell's exclusion from the creation and unveiling of the Drake Monument in Woodlawn Cemetery in Titusville highlights the difficulties he faced. No one knows what inspired Henry H. Rogers of Standard Oil to generously contribute to the creation of the Drake Monument in Woodlawn. R.D. Fletcher, who had loaned Drake money to continue drilling back in 1859, donated the plot of land, and the unveiling ceremony took place on October 4th, 1901, with thousands attending. Bell was not invited to be part of either the organizing committee or to be on the dais. However, he was the anonymous author of the Drake biographies that appeared in area newspapers, and his 1885 engraving adorned the program cover. Privately, Bell had to be deeply hurt by being ignored. To watch fellow journalists, P.C. Boyle, Marinus Allen, whose daughter Bell had married a few years before, W.H. Longwell, and John McLaren all publicly recognized, along with the likes of John McKinney, must have been crushing. But he surely felt a kinship with Mrs. Laura Drake, who sat on the dais. A silver-haired, classic-featured old lady with eyes anon-bedewed and lips quivering with the emotions kindled by the memory-quickening words of the speakers. Laura did not want her husband's remains moved at first from Bethlehem, PA. but relented after the monument was described to her. She was not the only woman seated on the dais, but of course, none were invited to speak. After the monument's dedication, Belle and Mrs. Drake began corresponding and built a friendship that lasted until her passing in 1915. Belle was once again publicly excluded when the golden anniversary of Drake's success came around in 1909. A grand tribute banquet was given at the Women's Club of Titusville on August 27th. Members of the Titusville Board of Trade organized the event to honor Drake, and the club was decorated with roses and asters on the table and bouquets on the mantel. R.D. Fletcher loaned a portrait of Drake, a painting of George Mowbray, the first buyer of crude along Oil Creek, excuse me, and the famous Drake well photograph by John Mather, all of which hung on the walls during the event. The magnificent dinner featured among the many courses a Colonel Drake salad with a choice of either standard or pure oil. One of the proposals presented that night was given by oil producer Samuel Grumbine on behalf of the Canada chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. The women were not invited to speak themselves. Susan Emery, widow of the late David Emery, donated the Drake well and an acre of ground to the DAR. Their plan was presented to create a petroleum monument to mark the well site to keep the historical site from obliteration. Grumbine said, "In recognition of the achievement of a man whose persistence, in spite of great obstacles, led to the most wonderful results in the history of the commercial world. His worth and his genius in the domain of scientific research have already been written on granite by his tomb. But the place which witnessed his triumph is obscure, unmarked, and almost unknown. It is the spot where first the rocks poured out rivers of oil that the Canada chapter had undertaken to rescue." Mostly wives and daughters of oil men, they asked through Grumbine, should we not all individually and collectively become identified with it and assist in the project by sympathetic cooperation and the aid of businessmen's experience in carrying out great enterprises? Their appeal to the powerful industry men was apparent. After the many speeches, Bell found himself one of a circle of old-timers reminiscing about the early days. There was a resolution to hold a banquet of this character every year, which was met with great enthusiasm by everyone. Though the Herald editor, Marinus Allen, praised the women, donations did not pour in. Despite some of his difficulties with the oil crowd, Bell persevered. August 27, 1910 came and went. But in 1911, Bell, along with other Titusville journalists and history lover John Scheide, son of a National Transit Company founder, came up with the idea of building a Drake Memorial Museum. The men of the press made the announcement, August 1911, of the founding of the Drake Memorial Museum and Reference Library, writing, "Much of this oil and gas history has been lost for want of a historian. Much more of it will be lost unless something is done for its preservation. Heretofore, it has been the want of a place, the want of a man of enthusiasm and interest." Well, Edwin Bell had been collecting data, documents, and newspapers which would be the foundation of the library and museum. The aim was to preserve the history of petroleum and to perpetuate the name of Titusville in connection with the Valley of Oil Creek to the world, as the locality where oil in quantity was first discovered, and further, to make it the Mecca upon which pilgrims can converge when in search of history related to petroleum and its products. It will be a place of reference, and not a storehouse of books and data where biased views or acts will prevail. It will be purely and simply a library and museum of history. Nothing more, nothing less. Therefore, all oil men, and even those not directly connected with the industry, can subscribe to its maintenance, having the purest motive in view of contributing to a beneficial object. The thousands of sand samples gathered by the father of petroleum geology, John Carl, were already part of the collection being stored in Bell's house. John Carl's son, Samuel, had given them to Patrick Boyle of the Oil City Derrick until an oil country museum was established. Boyle loaned his large collection of rare lighting devices as well. Subscriptions were sought through all the local newspapers. As with the Drake Monument in Woodlawn Cemetery, R.D. Fletcher, seen here in the center with the shovel, donated the land 3/4 of a mile from the post office on West Central Avenue in Titusville. Near the museum building, they planned to build a replica of the Drake well to house oil field tools and the sand samples. The walls of the museum would be decorated with tablets with the names of early oil men grouped around that of Drake. October 4th, 1911, R.D. Fletcher lifted the first spadeful of dirt, followed by Dr. George W. Barr, who donated an adjoining parcel of land. Perhaps 100 men and women attended along with the newspaper men, and Sam Smith, Uncle Billy's son, seen in the foreground on the right with the buttons down the front. Uncle Billy was the one that had drilled the Drake well with Drake. Marinus Allen praised Fletcher, saying his generosity to the colonel was matched only by Drake's fidelity. 10 days later, the newspaper men published in honor of Drake and the oil industry, with the goal of raising $25,000. Well, Bell went to work building, and by March 1912, only $825 had been donated, but Bell continued. The list of donors over the next couple of years reads as a who's who of oil men and companies who gave out of pride or inflated egos, or even out of guilt, since Drake had lived in poverty after the well's success. The purpose was to perpetuate and honor the name of the man whose persevering efforts founded the great petroleum industry. And researchers started to come, including English author J.D. Henry, who published his History and Romance of the Petroleum Industry, which relied heavily on Bell and his collection. As construction was nearing completion, Bell decided to schedule the first annual Drake Day on August 27, 1913, the 54th anniversary of Drake's success. He designed a Drake Club memorial button to be sold to fund the event. On Wednesday, August 27th at 2 p.m., more than 150 oil men gathered at the Mansion House in Titusville in front of a large crowd and marched to the Opera House, led by Coleman's band. There, Edwin Bell, as trustee of the Drake Memorial Museum, called the meeting to order and read several letters of regret from invited guests unable to attend. The final letter read was from Mrs. Laura Drake, which the Titusville Herald published the next day. Patrick C. Boyle, acting as the temporary chair of the program, began his remarks by honoring Drake. He described the Woodlawn Cemetery Drake Monument, then slighted the efforts of the Canada chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution to mark the site of the Drake Well. Boyle said a monument to Drake should be something more actively influential than an inanimate object. The men urged the building of a museum on the site and sought to enlist the active sympathies and awaken the philanthropic instincts of men engaged in the various branches of the oil business. The work of publicity completed, the newspapers are turning the movement over to those to whom it rightly belongs, the oil men. Was Bell a misogynist, or did he think the fundraising efforts of the women competed with the fundraising for the museum? Or did he just not like the monument idea? Was he irritated because some women were then agitating for the right to vote? Whatever his reasons, it is clear that the Drake Day Association was for men, and Bell wanted the women out of the spotlight. The rest of the afternoon was given over to impromptu remarks from members of the audience. Hosea Paul, then secretary of the Independent Refiners Association in Cleveland, spoke first, recounting his arrival in Titusville as the Civil War was ending. He praised Drake's sterling qualities and won a hearty volley of applause by calling on the crowd to thank Mrs. Drake, whose courage and assistance meant so much to her husband in the days when he was considered but a visionary dreamer. He described the scenes of the early days, saying, "The romance of oil will never die. The years but make those early days more full of interest. The old scenes, the old faces, the old incidents come flocking back to me as I think of years past, when this world was young to me, and oil men were flocking to Pennsylvania to seek their fortunes." He then told of going to Pithole, which was rapidly becoming forest again. He wistfully said that it was one of the most pathetic moments of his life as he stood where he once labored in the busy hive of men. All are gone. All have passed away to other fields or to another land beyond the sunset. But their memories endure, and the urban observance of Drake Day will serve to keep them green in the hearts of those who now follow the fortunes of the oil field. The next speaker also talked to Pithole, and John McLaurin spoke about how H. Rogers of Standard Oil revered Drake. J.G. Winger, then the oldest living driller, described Titusville when it was a crossroads, and Oil City was but a cornfield. Drake changed all that, he said. He described a model he was making of the second well he drilled. The labor I went through on that well and the fatigue that came through the use of that old set of drilling tools so impressed the well on my memory that every nail and every mark of the rig is remembered. When he finished the model, he was going to give it to the museum. When Boyle again took the podium, he paid tribute to R.D. Fletcher, who, by his moral and financial aid, made possible the striking of oil. As Fletcher rose, the crowd stood with a cheer and applauded for over a minute. When the meeting ended, many traveled to tour the unfinished museum. Photographer Bates of Titusville captured part of the crowd who were all strong supporters of the museum. Some of the men in this image are identified, but some are not. Presumably, These were the core supporters of the museum. As was his habit, Bell kept notes of the stories told to him by the oil pioneers. These penciled pages are part of the Bell collection held by the museum today. This is the memories of an oil producer at Petroleum Center in the mid-1860s. By the time Bell finished constructing the museum in 1914, the collections had outgrown the building and spilled over into the neighboring house, which became the annex. Now, Sarah Goodman, our educator, will show you some of the artifacts which remain part of the current museum's collections today.
Okay. Hello, everyone.
This is a cane made by Uncle Billy Smith, and who was the driller of the Drake Well. He was also a blacksmith and a wood carving artist. These bamboo-looking carvings surround a sucker rod used to pump the Drake Well.
Sue, what exactly is a sucker rod?
The sucker rod is a series of rods at the bottom of which is the valve, which when they're lifted, helps lift that oil up to the surface. It's part of the pumping mechanism.
Okay.
And these two plain-looking canes were made from wood, also from the Drake Well. The one with the octagonal head was a sucker rod, and the other one, the smaller one, was supposedly taken from a piece of the derrick in 1867 and carved by a man who later was a machinist and worked at the Titusville Iron Works.
Now, a question about these, Sue, is what are the little stickers on the bottom that are red and white?
Those were put on by Edwin C. Bell and helped tell me as curator that artifacts or papers with those red stickers were part of the original Drake Memorial Museum.
Interesting.
And there's another one, also made from the Drake Well, but this one was part of the fundraising efforts of the Daughters of the American Revolution. They hired woodworker P.C. Dunn of Titusville to create canes, paper knives, candlesticks, bookends, gavels, and paperweights, all made from the conductor or sill plates found while clearing the site of the well for their Boulder Museum or Boulder Monument and Rock Garden.
And Sue, what is a conductor?
The conductor is the piece of wooden pipe, or it could be a hollowed out tree trunk, that held back the gravel so that the drill could reach bedrock and drill through rock. Otherwise, the hole just collapses in on itself.
Okay.
And the DAR also made special canes like this one with the silver tip and then a silver band around the collar. And this one reads, William Bayliss, made from original wooden conductor of the Drake Well. On August 27, 1859, petroleum oil was first found near Titusville, PA, depth 69.5 feet. Bayliss was the president of the Second National Bank, and maybe he had loaned or donated some significant amount to the ladies for their Boulder monument. Thank you, Sarah.
Yep.
In 1914, the celebration was held at Fieldmore Springs. It was again an impressive list of attendees. Alf W. Smiley, a well-known humorist and storyteller from Foxburg, spoke, saying, "What an honor it was to be led into the circle by his admiring friends." He was deeply touched, but wasn't going to say anything that might incriminate himself. The Honorable William Hasson of Oil City, an early oilman, told of visiting the Drake well 9 days after it came in. The passing years had failed to erase the impressions Mr. Hasson received of the remarkable man who gave petroleum to the world. Unlike Boyle, the previous year, Speaker John McLaren praised the ladies of the DAR for their monument efforts. Other than his words, the women's work went unnoticed. That year, Ida Horner had found the 5-ton boulder and oversaw its removal from a mile down the valley to the well site. Workers had laid up crib work and mounted the huge stone, and the ladies created a beautiful rock garden surrounding it and the wellhead. They were still trying to raise funds to finish their efforts, which would be a bronze plaque for the front. John McLaren chided Titusville, saying, "The people of Titusville take the least interest in the celebration of Drake Day of any of the people of the oil regions. They should be the first to celebrate the day, and they are in fact the very last." It was no surprise when the Oil City Chamber of Commerce stepped forward in early 1915 to take over the event. Oil City went all out decorating their businesses. A crowd of 1,500 at Monarch Park swelled to over 5,000 as shops and businesses closed at the end of the day. An impressive list of powerful oil men were scheduled to speak. The Secretary and General Counsel of the National Petroleum Association spoke, as did the Director of the United States Geological Survey and the U.S. Secretary of the Interior. One newspaper wrote, "Not even accepting the dedication of the monument erected in memory to Drake in Woodlawn Cemetery have so many states been represented by oil or pipeline men as at Friday's meeting at Monarch Park." Another wrote, "There were men present who had seen their fondest hopes decay when dry holes were drilled in, but they showed no disappointment in their bearing. There were men who had suffered loss in 100 different ways, but they laughed as heartily as the rest, and trouble to them was simply part of the day's work." It was indeed a remarkable gathering of oilmen, young and old alike, all brought together by a single common thread, petroleum. Beneath the laughter and celebration, as Drake and the old-timers were remembered and honored, was the somberness to the changing of the guard. One of those missing was photographer John Mather, who had passed away just days before the gathering. As with the other Drake Day events, there were no special activities planned for the ladies, but we can guess that they too shared their memories of the days gone by, just not in front of the crowd. In his welcoming address, Oil City Mayor J.R. Siggins lamented upon the need for a more fitting monument to Drake and the early oilmen. "For years, when I have had the occasion to travel up and down Oil Creek, I have felt some sadness at the lonesome spot where the Drake well was drilled. It seems to me that something more ornate should mark the spot where this well was drilled. It seems to me that the industry would be warranted in having a much greater and more imposing monument to Drake. I believe there are a great many people of the same mind, and a much greater monument ought to be erected to mark the spot of the Colonel Drake well. Again, no mention was made about the DAR monument being completed with the bronze tablet and its inscription honoring Drake. Bell was the last to speak, this time talking about Historic Petroleum Center. After giving some history, he again shared information about the museum and pleaded for support. So what is the legacy of the Drake Day Association? Fortunately, we've got the published stories of some of the oil men. Boyle published a great deal of historical facts, but his own life remains private and unknown to a large extent. We still don't know why he collected all of the lamps. What portion of his manuscripts can be found, the Friends of Drake Well published as a special edition of the Oilfield Journal in 2012. Edwin Bell, seen here, also published histories, plus we have his manuscripts, which include his own diary for a couple of years, as well as his written record of some of the personal interviews he took during the annual Drake Day meetings. His collection of newspapers, documents, and manuscript collections have also been preserved, giving us a glimpse into the daily life of some oil field workers. Bell arranged for the purchase of 2,200 glass plate negatives from John Mather's daughter in 1915. Other collections have been added since that time to almost fill a full aisle of shelving in the climate-controlled collection storage room. In 1913, Samuel Paste attended the annual Drake Day Association meeting and said he would donate artifacts from the Maple Shade Oil Company to the Drake Memorial Museum. Paste was born in Philadelphia, served during the Civil War, then moved to Petroleum Center with his parents after the war. His father, Charles Paste, was the manager for the Maple Shade Oil Company on the Egbert Farm, Oil Creek Valley. In the E.C. Bell collection, there's a handwritten and typed version of a gift agreement with Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Paste, which lists these items. Here's a Maple Shade account book, a clock from the Maple Shade office, scales used to weigh mail at Petroleum Center, the account book of the toll bridge across Oil Creek from the Egbert Farm to Petroleum Center, and a copy of the 1872-3 Oil Region Directory. Samuel worked in the oil fields, then became a telegraph operator for the Oil Creek Railroad. His wife, Emma, opened a cigar and music store in Titusville. The legacy of some oil men and the efforts of Edwin C. Bell live on today at the Drake Well Museum and Park. Without Edwin Bell, which of these artifacts would have survived? Would a descendant cleaning out a garage of a deceased grandparent have saved them or thrown them out? What we don't have are the stories from the women. What was life like in, say, Pioneer Petroleum Center in 1867 for a young pregnant wife of an oil man? The people of color who sometimes appear in the photographs seem non-existent in the historical written record. Where are their stories and artifacts? And where are the stories and artifacts of the people of the Seneca Nation who still lived in the area when Drake drilled for oil? So how can you help? Are there existing records of the oil pioneering women? We're always looking for the early primary documents and artifacts, Are there stories and artifacts from other Pennsylvania oil fields being safeguarded somewhere? Or will they become the lost memories of independent oil men and women? Thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Thank you so much, Sue. That was really great. I am looking in the Q&A and I don't see that we have any questions right now, but if anybody has a question for Sue, please go ahead and type it in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. She will be happy to answer questions. I had a thought as I was listening to this presentation again. Sue, what do you think? There's definitely a difference between, a socioeconomic difference between, the working class folks who worked leases and worked well sites, and these folks, these men really, and even some of the women, right, who are doing this work to commemorate Drake and the Drake well. What do you think that, how much say do you think that folks, who were the workers, who were toiling day in and day out at wells had in this commemoration?
I think many attended the events. Their name doesn't appear in the newspaper. But like Winger, some cared about history and made a point of forcing themselves forward. But I'm guessing that many were just intimidated by the wealth and, the self-importance of people like McKinney, and just stayed in the background. Much like that happens oftentimes today.
All right. We have a question from Nicholas Walters asking, when was the railroad built, before or after the well?
After.
After. I'm assuming we're talking about the Oil Creek and Titusville Railroad, or actually any of them, really.
Well, the original Oil Creek Railroad, which is where the bike trail is today through Oil Creek State Park, was begun in Corey in 1862 and didn't reach Petroleum Center until 1866.
All right. Any other questions, folks? Let me check the chat. I don't see any questions in the chat. Thank you again, Sue. Appreciate all of the hard work that went into the research for this. We have a comment from Roseanne in the chat saying that it would have been very interesting to have the stories of the women and the people of color.
Still hoping.
Yep.
Still hoping we'll find them.
Absolutely. If we don't have any more questions, like I said, thank you very much, Sue. And thank you to folks who joined us this afternoon. If you enjoyed this program, please, next week, we are going to have a program for Ask a Curator Day. It's the 10th anniversary of the National Ask a Curator movement. And event, and we will be partnering with the Pennsylvania Lumber Museum to take any questions that folks have about the Drakewell Museum collection or the Pennsylvania Lumber Museum collection. So Sue will be joining curator Joshua Fox at the Pennsylvania Lumber Museum to answer any questions that folks have. Please take a look at our Facebook page to get the information to attend that event. And it looks like we have a couple of questions here. How did they know that oil was there?
The Native Americans had been excavating for oil at the site of the Drake well for possibly 1,000 years. The crib work in some of our pits dates to 1410 to 1460. So we can guess they were excavating for oil long before then. Wherever there's surface seeps of oil or natural gas, people around the world generally have found ways to use it.
Very good. And we have one more question here. Are there any historical fiction books written about the Drake Well area?
Yes, we've got a shelf full.
We do. If you visit, I'm trying to think. I'm not sure that our e-store is currently live on our website, but if you give us your contact information in the chat, we would be happy to send you a list of those books.
Or you can go
so that you have the
to
titles.
you can go to an online Pennsylvania Access, for example, or go to your local library and key in oil fiction, and you can probably come up with some titles.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you again, Sue. Much appreciated. I hope you enjoy your weekend. And thanks again to all of those folks out there who joined us for this encore presentation of our Drake Day celebration. And we hope to see you next week at Ask a Curator. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Bye.